America's #2 diplomat is set to meet with China's new ambassador as the world's two largest economies navigate strained relations. Wendy, Sherman and Qin Gang are scheduled to meet at the State Department in Washington. The U.S. Deputy Secretary of State held high-level talks with Beijing as last month. Now, both sides have already agreed concessions have to be made for those ties to improve. Simon Marks joins us live now from Washington, D.C. for more. Simon, it's a signal that both sides are maintaining open lines of communication.
Well, it certainly signifies some degree of normalcy in the diplomatic relationship, at least here in Washington, D.C., and that comes after Wendy Sherman's very difficult set of meetings with Chinese officials in Tianjin last month that are described by both sides as having been candid and a frank exchange of views. The Chinese attempted to constrain areas that the Deputy Secretary of State intended to raise in those conversations, and of course she raised them anyway. But the fact that this meeting's going to take place here later today at the State Department certainly is an indication that at a time of increasing tensions, most recently this week over the treatment of two Canadians by Chinese legal authorities in China, the United States backing calls for their unconditional release by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Despite those ongoing tensions in the relationship, there is at least a conversation taking place here that, of course, could give rise to further dialogue in the weeks and months ahead.
And Simon, is there a chance that this could perhaps pave the way for a meeting, potentially, between President Joe Biden and the Chinese leader as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're all looking for. Is there a possibility, first of all, perhaps of a face-to-face meeting at Secretary of State and Foreign Minister level for the first time since Antony Blinken attended those contentious talks in Alaska, hosting top Chinese officials shortly after Joe Biden became president of the United States? And could that in turn then cement an agreement for a face-to-face meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi? There have been questions that the White House has dodged about whether there's a possibility of them meeting at the UN General Assembly or later in the year. Remember that Joe Biden this week announced that he is pressing ahead with his Summit of Democracy. That's taking place virtually now in December. He sees that as a moment that will send a message to China that he's building a coalition of democracies on the world stage, he says, to prove that democracy works and can win the battle for the 21st century against autocracies like China and Russia. But White House officials certainly have not ruled out the possibility of a face-to-face meeting at some point.
Simon, thank you very much for that update. Simon Marks there in Washington, D.C. Well, for China's perspective, Lo Minmin joins us live now from Beijing. Minmin, China's U.S. envoy Qin Gang, he has his work cut out for him, doesn't he?
Yes, indeed. This is his first high-level meeting after completing a 14-day quarantine in the U.S., and it's going to set the tone for the rest of his tenure in the U.S. He started out optimistically saying that there is great potential for U.S.-China relations, but observers say that he is one who is willing to ruffle feathers when necessary, and that's because he has hit out very pointedly, defending his country's positions in the past. And what sets him apart from his predecessors is that China has sent a string of American experts for the past 20 years to Washington, but Qin has no American experience. Instead, he served in high-level foreign ministry positions in the UK and Western Europe, but he's really made his name as a two-time foreign ministry spokesperson and is seen as a pioneer of the kind of wolf warrior-style diplomacy that we see today. And he's a really interesting character. If you talk to foreign correspondents who've been based here for decades, they remember him for his punchy one-liners and his willingness to mock journalists. He's once compared China's management of Tibet to US's Abraham Lincoln's emancipation of black for black laborers. And he has also chided journalists, telling them not to report based on their delusions. He's adept at sparring with journalists. And that's a departure from his predecessor, Cui Tiankai, who is seen as a moderate who has been distancing himself from some of the COVID-19 origin theories pushed out by some of China's rising diplomats. And in 2008, Qin shepherded foreign journalists at the opening of the Beijing Olympics, which is seen as kind of a coming out party for China, for a resurgent China. So Qin has his role cut out for him, not just because it's going to be a steep learning curve getting familiar with American affairs, but also because he's serving at a time of great, very strained relations between the two countries. And so the task he's facing will be more intense and complicated than ever before.
And Min, we know that China had a rather tough 4 years with the Trump administration, but it looks like it might be having an even harder time with President Joe Biden.
Yes, indeed. When Wendy Sherman visited China last month in Tianjin, meeting her Chinese counterparts, they left the meeting with China listing for the first time a list of red lines and prerequisites that the U.S. need to fulfill in order to repair their relationship, with Deputy Foreign Minister Xie Feng calling the relationship at a stalemate. And some of these preconditions include lifting sanctions and visa restrictions on Chinese officials and Chinese students, but also dropping that extradition call on Huawei's chief finance executive, Meng Wanzhou, which doesn't look likely given that the last phases of her extradition hearing is already ongoing in Canada. And of course, in the first 6 months of Biden's administration alone, they have already imposed sanctions on Chinese officials involved in the crackdown in Hong Kong. They have passed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. They have imposed crackdown on export controls on Chinese tech firms, and they have also supported other countries like Australia in its trade dispute with China. So, they are in one of the most strained relations in the past 40 years. And Biden's administration has successfully created a more united front with Europe and Asia. And so Qin has to, find the middle ground between two seemingly contradictory priorities here. He has to project strength and confidence to satisfy an increasingly nationalistic domestic audience, but at the same time, he needs to create a placatory and diplomatic tone with the U.S. in an international political environment that is increasingly hostile towards China. So that's a tall order.
Min, thank you very much for that. Lo Min there in Beijing.